We are very excited to welcome Westerhold here to give us a little bit of an education on how to build an operating plan. Leads our strategic finance team and has done a version of this talk for us internally who have not had her same excellent operating experience in the past, and for a number of our other portfolio companies, and it is always well received. Please join me in welcoming Em.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. As Guy said, I'm Emily Westerhold. Most people call me Em. And today I'm going to talk to you about building operating plans. And I actually saw all the responses to the surveys that you guys submitted, and I really want to thank you because it gave me a sense of the wide range of experience that you all have. And I want to make sure today we're kind of setting a good foundation in talking about operating plans, and then we can kind of go from there, and we'll have time for Q&A. And also I can be available, in office hours and follow up as well. So with that, in terms of why am I standing here talking to you about this today? Over my career, the last few decades, I've been very fortunate to see a lot of startups in different capacities. So I've worked with really early stage companies, helped them scale. I've also worked with more mature companies through the IPO process and, into public company life. So I've seen it both as an operator, also as an, advisor, board member, consultant. So I've kind of done a lot of this from both the doer and the sort of reviewer advisor side. And in my role here at A16Z Crypto, that's really what I help our portfolio companies do as well, is as it relates to finance, accounting, business operations, I help think about best practices, preferred vendors, advice on things like that, as well as we have a finance community that we have on Telegram, as well as an email alias where we sort of like share best practices and get together as a group. I see a lot of this, and so hopefully I can answer some questions for you. When I talk about operating plans, I actually really always like this quote because there's a lot of things as a startup founder that you can't control. And I think we all know that building companies is really hard. And there is something you can control, though, and that's planning. And like with many things in life, I think it's helpful to focus on what you can control. And it would be a missed opportunity not to take the action of planning seriously. So what is an operating plan? Like, what do I even mean by this? I think from a business context, it's pretty simple. Like, you're going to hear me say this over and over, but it's what are you doing? What's everyone doing? How much does it cost? When are they doing it? How are they being measured? It's those really simple questions that you just do on repeat to know that you're acting on a plan. And just for a quick example, I know that you all do this in your daily lives all the time. So, I have up here planning a trip, moving to a new city, training for a race. Like an example of this, I ran a marathon years ago, and I know there's a whole training plan, right? Many months long. You have to know, when are you doing your long runs? What is the route for your runs? What is your plan for rest and recovery? You have to have feedback loops in your plan, because what if you have an injury? What if something goes wrong or you're getting sore? Like, you have to be able to take in that information and iterate on your plan. And so that is a very basic example, but I just use it to emphasize that, like, you all do this all the time in your lives, and it's just kind of taking that and being, one step more intentional about it when it comes to the business. The other thing I will say is your race day might be, like in my analogy there, like your race day might be like a token launch or like a really big product launch or something. And so working backwards to what that requires is just a really important thought process. Before we dig a little deeper, one thing to distinguish. So the strategic plan is kind of that big picture vision. We're not really going to talk about that today because as founders, that's really your number one job, and you've probably all nailed it pretty well because you're in CSX. Like, you've been able to convince investors to get behind your vision and see the world through your lens. And so now that next step is really, how do you take that vision and put a very actionable plan behind it and get your team, no matter how big it is, to operate on that same plan? So again, I'm going to say it a bunch of times. Who's doing what? By when? How much does it cost? How are you measuring it? These are the things you're going to hear over and over. So, some key components of a good operating plan. The thing here that I think it's worth mentioning is like you shouldn't be overly academic about an operating plan and don't overthink it. There are a lot of frameworks out there that talk about all sorts of best practices for building a plan. And we're going to actually go through some templates today. We're going to, you actually have some that we handed out, and we're going to go through a few different examples and ways you can think about it. But it's actually like the act of putting something on paper and being able to clearly articulate, again, like people, cost, timing, and ownership, who's doing what, as well as the trade-offs you're making. And you should be making trade-offs in your plan. You can't do it all. So trade-offs are healthy. They should be hard. They should foster good discussion, and that should be an important part. But don't be overly concerned about how the plan manifests itself in terms of like a deliverable. I've been in situations where, you bring in consultants and you have like a lot of meetings and you have a lot of different worksheets or programmatic approaches of that has to be this way. And the end result is not necessarily more effective, even if the output might be a bit more polished. So I wouldn't get overly concerned about that. Where do things go wrong? The thing that I see most, so I sort of bucketed this into 3 loose categories of mistakes. But if I could only put one bullet point on the slide, it would be the first one. And what I mean by being overly optimistic is that information is changing all the time. And what you may do is set out a plan, and the plan has all of these dependencies, right? Okay, we want to launch this product. In order to launch this product, we have to hire these 2 engineers. And then after we launch it, we think revenue is going to go up and to the right. And like we have to hire this marketing person to do this. And it's got all these things that sort of layer it into a cohesive plan. But if you're late in even hiring those engineers, and then you don't shift the rest of the downstream plan, you're going to miss deadlines and you're going to be somehow surprised by that. So I will tell you that everything takes longer than you think, generally, as a good rule of thumb. And you should work that into your mentality of like, if you miss a first milestone in your plan, don't assume that all the other milestones you're going to hit, because if there's dependencies, you're going to have to push them all out or rework how you're thinking about something. So you should be optimistic. You're founders and you have to be, but also you have to be realistic and know when to incorporate those changes into your plan. It's like being agile and being flexible. I think that's really important, and that's where things go wrong a lot. Second category here, lack of focus. I think lack of focus and not sequencing are 2 sort of interrelated things. Many of you may have a lot of ideas of what you can do with the business, and it's exciting, and you've got a lot of things you want to work on. And that's better than not having ideas. I would take that any day. But the problem is you can't do it all at once, and if you do, you're going to really damage your cash burn and the focus of your team. So what I would do is think about sort of that strategic sequencing of opportunities. And instead of doing multiple things at once, the power of sequencing is maybe one thing unlocks the capability to do something else. So if you can work on a technology, or you can work on a product launch that buys you new users or gets you revenue, that sort of unlocks the opportunity to go do something else that leverages those users or leverages that technology. And so think about the order in which you're doing things so that you are not doing all your bets at once and kind of spending both your money and your focus time. That's another thing where things go wrong. And I think a sign of this, by the way, is like, if you are saying, if I asked you, like, what's your number 1 priority in the business, and you say your number 1 priority, and then I say, how's everyone spending their time? And that number 1 priority is only getting, I don't know, like 30% of the time or something. Like, that's wait a minute. Are we actually acting in what we think we should be doing? And you got to reconcile that. The third one here is just, you'd be surprised how often you can lay out a great plan. If you're not measuring it or monitoring it, it doesn't matter. It's just going to go in the garbage because you don't even know how you're doing on it or like how to really adjust. Sequencing. One thing to remember there is if you are saying, I'm going to do this later, Sequencing does not mean you're not going to do something. And I've seen that be like scary for people of like, oh, I want to do all of these things. But it doesn't mean no. It just means not now. And so think about like, okay, I can do this thing. I feel good that I can do this thing, but I'm going to wait 6 months to do it because I need to focus on something else first. So budget. This is worth its own segment. This is something I've spent a lot of time in the portfolio talking to founders about, talking to finance teams about, and a lot of time in my own life on it. So it's worth spending some time on tips here. So first of all, most companies spend most of their money on employees. Not always the case, but a good general rule. And what I often see underestimated is the fully burdened cost of bringing on employees. And what I mean by that is there's not just payroll taxes and benefits, but there's also other costs associated, whether it's like hardware, software costs, license seats for things, or even like travel costs or things like that. But you really want to just make sure you're being comprehensive because that can sometimes surprise people. And that's the biggest part of your budget. The other thing to note here is we could probably spend a whole session on equity, but just make sure you budget it like your cash. And if you do get into a token comp situation, like that's with even more rigor, you'll want to think about that. So don't forget when you're planning out your budget from a cash perspective to also plan out your budget from an equity perspective. Separate fixed and variable costs. So it's really good to know and have a really good pulse on like what are the dials in your budget. So what is fixed, what is variable? And if someone said to you tomorrow, or you decided tomorrow that you had to cut 30% of your costs for some reason, do you have a pretty good idea of how you do that? Like that should be pretty intuitive if you have a good sense of your dials in your model. And that's harder when you're early because you don't have as many costs, but like as you grow and you're like bringing more costs into your budget, like you want to know, hey, something's working, I want to lay on the gas. How do you do that? Like, how do you, an easy one that may not apply to a lot of the group, but it could be like marketing, right? It could be some sort of like variable marketing spend that you're just like, something's working, I know how to lay on the gas there. It can be other things as well. But those variable costs being separate from your fixed gives you a good sense of like how kind of, flexible is my budget and what are my dials. In terms of contracts, just best practice, negotiate contracts. Don't put multi-year, like long contracts in place if you can avoid it. Again, like remain flexible, agile as much as you can. Scenario planning. So the two that I bolded are the two that I think are most important. That's a hint. Obviously, I bolded them for a reason. So scenario planning. So any budget that you build is going to be wrong. I know it, you know it, everyone knows it. It's going to be wrong. By what factor? I don't know. That depends, but it's going to be wrong. So even mature companies, it's going to be wrong, by the way. So the most important thing here is like scenario planning is like giving you a range of confidence in the outcomes. What are the possibilities? Like, what are those levers in my financial model that could either make things go extremely well, extremely poorly, what things could surprise me? If you have regulatory uncertainty, for example, like, often the case in our industry, like what could our model look like in 2 states of the world where we have regulatory clarity? I don't know. That may be worth a thought exercise. So scenario planning is just helping you get comfortable with a range of outcomes instead of getting fixated on one specific outcome. And really thinking about what are the different states of the world and how comfortable am I sort of navigating between them. One best practice there is putting confidence intervals on it too. Like that's something I've done in the past where it's just like, this number I feel like really good about. This is low likelihood, but there is a possible world, and kind of giving yourself comfort over that range. All right. The other thing here, most importantly, is not getting below 6 months of runway. Hopefully you've probably all heard this before, but it's like managing your cash, and it's just a different mode of operation. You don't want to ever be surprised when it comes to your cash burn, and it happens all the time. Like something goes wrong, your burn is worse than you thought, and you have to adjust. Like it happens to so many companies. Like it's not something to be like ashamed of, right? It's just you want to get ahead of that. You want to get ahead because if you are in a less than 6 months cash situation, you are going to be actively spending most of your mental energy on figuring out how to extend your runway. You're either going to be fundraising or you're going to be trying to cut costs or that is going to be where your energy is, because even if you were able to secure an investor, then it does take time to close the round, negotiate docs. You're probably racking up some legal fees in the meantime. And everything, again, takes longer than you think. So you want to prevent that. And the best way to do that is to have a budget that you are on top of. Don't outsource this too much as founders. Like, make sure you're on top of it. And it doesn't mean you have to do it, right? Like if you have, an accounting firm outsourced doing fractional work for you or something, but you've got to be on top of like, what did I think I was going to burn this month? What did I actually burn? That's sort of the monthly reforecast. And is there a learning moment there? If I was materially off from what I thought I was going to spend, is there a learning moment there, or is it just a one-off? Or was I really thinking about how I was going to spend something incorrectly? Just staying on top of it and knowing, get ahead of it. And then zero-based budgeting. So this isn't something that you have to do, but personally, I love zero-based budgeting. I think it's worth talking about. And so for those of you that aren't familiar, most people, when they make budgets, they make a budget. The next year, they look at what they actually spent, and they just sort of edit it. It's like, we spent this last year, so we're probably going to spend that plus or minus 10% this year. And you just sort of edit. You don't actually go through the critical thinking of starting from scratch and saying, like, what do I actually need this year? So zero-based budgeting is sort of, I would say, like a more critical eye at what do we need to spend each year, and giving it that thorough thought to make sure that you can justify like why you're spending everything and you're not just like rolling it forward from the prior year. So I love that. I think it's healthy. You don't have to do it, but thought it was worth mentioning. Frameworks and tools. So this is where you'll see some printouts. Really, this is intended, if you kind of go back to what I said earlier, like not to be overly academic about this. There's like so many ways to build an operating plan. There's so many deliverables you can have. And it really comes down to that sort of like who's doing what, by when, why, how are you measuring it, how much does it cost? Like those are the questions. And so I thought I'd share a few different frameworks. First of all, though, we should decide what mode you're in, okay? So that's why I did this little flow chart of like what operating mode are you in is important before you go into the budgeting step and the planning step. And kind of going back to my runway, it's like, will you ever raise money again? Well, probably, because most venture-backed early-stage companies will raise money again, but maybe there are some exceptions and you're profitable, great. But if not, you're going to want to think about, is your runway greater or less than 12 months? And the distinction there is like, if your runway is more than 12 months, like it's not that you don't need to watch it. It's just that you have a little more flexibility that fundraising or extending your runway doesn't need to be like a top priority in your planning for the year. Maybe it's like, building your product or hiring a team or some other aspect, but you can focus on other things. If it's less than 12 months, I would say when you're thinking about your operating plan, either fundraising or cutting costs or both need to be part of your planning. And usually it's fundraising. And you may take a critical look at your spend. It's not a black and white line in the sand, This is a playbook. And I think that, let's just kind of walk through it and what these mean. So what milestones do you believe need to be achieved in order to convince investors to further fund your next round? Okay, that's like a very critical question to start with when you're doing your plan. And that's a good conversation to have with your investors. It's a good conversation to have with one another. But having alignment there is important. And it's not necessarily like, oh, that's never going to change. It's just like, you may think if you launch this product, you can go out and raise a round. And one of your investors may tell you, I think you actually should show some product market fit, and then you'll be able to do it. I don't know. It depends on the business and what you're building and like what sort of round you want to raise. I think the important thing is like, what are you building to? That's kind of the first step. What's that next milestone? And then what resources do you need to achieve that? If you just had a blank slate of paper and you're like, I want to build this thing, launch this thing, whatever, What do I need to hire? What do I need to do? How long do I think that's going to take? What resources do I need? Put that on paper. And if you cost that all out in a spreadsheet or a Google sheet or whatever you want to do, if you kind of cost that out into a loose budget, what does it tell you? Does your cash cover you? The cash you have in the bank? Do you have a deficit? That's when you then revisit the plan if you need to. So it's sort of like, what variables do I need to tweak to make this equation work? And if you are not thinking like, what do I need to achieve to raise more money? What resources and hires do I need to get there? If I cost that all out, what's the gap, if there's a gap? That's sort of like you rinse and repeat, iterate through that until you land in a place that you feel good about. That's where you might lean on the power of sequencing, or you might really think about reprioritizing, some current goals in your plan. If you do that, then you need to make a plan to monitor it. And how do you know it's working? Putting in place some sort of, cadence to that is important. Like, this worksheet just gives you some boxes to start sketching out ideas there, but that's really what it's intended for. If you can answer those questions, you're like well on your way. So this is an operating goals template. This is intended to be not a sophisticated document. I personally like kind of starting with annual goals and thinking about like what might I want to achieve on an annual basis. And then if you work backwards, like, okay, what does that mean for this quarter? What does that mean for next quarter? And how do I do that by team or by function or by person even, depending on the size of your company? But it's just like, it's like getting this on paper and thinking through it is actually really half the battle. Because if it's in your head, it's just, you're gonna miss things. This is just an idea for measurement. I always like this of like red, green, yellow. And how I've used this in the past, just as an idea, is like, as a CFO, I would bring this to like a weekly leadership meeting for the goals I was responsible for. And it was just a really quick pulse check of like, hey, this is green, it's on track, not worried about meeting this goal. Hey, this is red, like we need to discuss this because we're gonna have an issue. Or, hey, this is yellow, there's a little hiccup, but I feel in control about it. Let's touch base on it in another week or two. You can use it how you see fit, but it's like, how do you do these things that I'm talking about in a way that isn't really cumbersome, right? Like, we don't need some big bureaucratic process to your planning and your measurement. But like, what's a quick way for you to hold people accountable, hold yourself accountable, and like visualize how our goals doing? This is a good way. I like it. This is a plan in 7 approach. I've done this before where it's just a good thought exercise. This is just a discussion guide. It's very consistent to everything I've been talking about, but it's just like, can you answer these questions? Can you go through them to help you identify a plan? And it's kind of simple because it's just plan in 7. Gantt charts. I'm sure you've all used Gantt charts. I love Gantt charts, so I wanted to put one in. But, when everyone used to be in office, I always loved seeing, Gantt charts on the wall, like feeling that visual stimulation of like progress and how's everyone doing. And obviously you can do it on websites today and like share it with everyone. But I think just, again, visual, like people learn differently, see things differently. How are things progressing? And what's a quick gut check? It's really easy to see like, oh, this is supposed to be done next month. Shoot, we're behind. Or, oh, this is great, right? With the rest of our time, this is really simple, but I wanted to go through a case study for this made-up company called Cosmic Cones, which is a local ice cream shop. And it's just gonna take a minute, but to show you how this actually plays out in practice. So they have a strategic goal. Become the top-rated ice cream shop in the city by next year. They have identified 4 operational objectives. And I would say 3 to 5 objectives is usually good. Like more than 5 is kind of too many, then you get into that focus problem. But if you have 4 operational objectives, and you can kind of see when you read each of these that there's quantifiable things in there, and they have a hypothesis on how each of those objectives is going to drive that strategic goal. And you kind of want them to like ladder up to that strategic goal. Like, how are they supporting that goal? Seasonal flavors, they're going to keep the menu exciting. That's going to keep people coming back. You've got local visibility, things you can measure like social media follows, brand partnerships. Maybe you do a brand survey, customer loyalty programs. Like, they're thinking about what are the mechanisms to achieve this goal. And so if we just double click on one of these and see what that looks like if you're making a plan. So say you did this, and now we talked about objective 2. Improve local visibility by increasing social media follows and establishing brand partnerships. So people, timing, cost, and the metric. If you can do this for each objective, that's your plan. Like, you're done. You're good. Here, they're going to hire a head of marketing. That's their people. That's the only one they need based on that objective. The timing. They're going to front load their key hire. They're going to think about, prioritizing their brand partnerships at the beginning of the year so that they have it ahead of summer season. This is all very relevant to everything you guys are doing, right, with the ice cream shop. The cost, they're going to look through, like, what does this cost? And here's our budget. And they're not going to exceed it. And then their metrics, they have some things they're going to measure, and they think those things are going to drive the result they're looking for. And truly, and this is what one of the worksheets is, it's just like objective with fill in people, timing, cost, metric. If you do that, it truly is your plan. Going through that thought process and how that translates into a budget, if you accompany that with a budget, you're in really good shape. Hopefully that gives you a good overview on operating plans and budgets. I'm here for the next 30 minutes or so to answer questions.
What are your tips for designing good metrics and then having a good accountability system? Because it sometimes feels kind of easy to be like, I'm going to have 3 engineers, and they're going to do X work. And then at the end of the quarter, you're like, well, the money left the bank account. The engineers are here. Where is the work? And
Yeah.
I feel like the discrepancy between the budget and reality is something that I've had a couple problems with in the past, and would love your tips on how to fight that.
I think that it's honestly more of an art than a science. It's hard. I think one of the things that people often think about that is important, but it can go too far, is like, what are the second order effects of a metric? Because what you incentivize usually drives behavior. So if you think about, like, what are the metrics I'm putting in place, and you just kind of, before you really solidify it, like, what are all the second order effects that could happen if I drive too hard into this particular metric? Sometimes that can protect you a bit from making like bad metrics choices. So that's something to think about, is just what behavior does this drive? But I think ultimately your job is to make sure everyone is working on the right things. And that's going to vary so much, like, business to business. So like it's hard to say like specifics, right? But I've definitely seen situations where you get metrics that are not driving actual outcomes. And so like that's the one tip I would probably have there, is like focusing on how the metric drives an outcome and not just activity. Because oftentimes, like, let's just take, your engineering example. What if you wouldn't do this, but what if it was just like hours worked? Like, you don't care about hours worked. That's like an activity, right? And so there may be something similar to that. I mean, I'm not an engineer, but like the code you submit or something where it's just like, is that the thing, or is it actually the result? And that's probably my biggest tip, is just focusing on making sure you're finding a metric that is the actual outcome and not the activity.
Hi, recently there's a discussion about like a founder mode versus kind of like restaurant. So for our startup, it's all like probably 10% and less, right? Like in this very early mode, I guess everyone is probably more founder mode, as you cannot even afford a professional engineer managers or managers. But slowly, when you get to scale up a little bit and you want to offload the direct person management to 1%, hope say they manage a 3% engineering team. What is your approach to make sure you can offload the basically kind of whipping and make sure things go in the right progress to one of your direct reports, rather than you basically try to keep track of everyone's progress? Especially say when you, like as a founder, when you travel for 2 months, your company is probably just doing nothing for 2 months. Even if they look very busy and looking like they submit code, and in reality, it's like a lot of times I experience this a lot.
It's so funny how much press the founder mode thing got. But if I can kind of distill your question, you're sort of like, as you grow and you bring more people on, how do you sort of make sure that progress is continuing and you can hold people accountable, but you're still like getting information? Is that sort of, is that the essence of your question? Yeah, and you're not like in the weeds. I think part of it is just designing systems for check-in, like even that like red, green, yellow thing that I put up there, like is designing systems that help you identify, put accountability on your direct reports to sort of up report to you, like what's a pulse check on how things are going. And then maybe another system might be like, okay, you're not gonna do the finance and accounting and stuff anymore. Like you're not even that you're doing it now, I don't know. But like at a certain point, you're not touching that. But even when I've been at larger companies, there's a monthly meeting where you're going through the finances with the CEO, and it's setting up a system of like, it's just not so in the weeds. It's like, what do you need to know? What's material? And that materiality level is going to change as you get bigger. So like maybe now you want to see everything that leaves your bank account because maybe you're clicking the button to pay those bills, as you should. But if you have raised $50 million or something, maybe you don't need to see everything that leaves the bank account anymore. But maybe you want your head of finance to send you every month, like any transaction over X amount. And you want to make sure that you're on top of that. So it's sort of like systems and controls based on like what's material and what's your priority at the time. There may be things that you intentionally say, I'm just not going to worry about this because even if it's on fire, it doesn't destroy the business. And I'm going to focus on this. And that's sort of like a founder decision, right? Like some people kind of want to have purview on everything. Some people want to focus on like the very 2 or 3 like critical things, and everything else they're going to kind of delegate to a number 2 or something. But that's something to think about too, and just like how you allocate your time. But I would also say when it comes to hiring your next layer, hiring people that you really, really trust and have like close working relationships with, it's not going to come overnight, right? But like you can build that, and building that in a way that is like a really strong foundation that they don't feel worried about bringing anything to you, like that's really important.
Thanks a lot for the talk. So we're building a new L1, and some of our advisors have said that to build a good L1 that is reputable, you would have to at some point raise rounds bigger than 100 million and so on to kind of show the community that you're here to stay. And is also building L1s are mostly expensive. We think that we have raised a good amount and we have a good runway, and we might do another round, probably big, but it's very unclear to me that why would you need such a big amount, or if you have experience on like what are the major costs for L1s, and how to think about it. I mean, I guess there's also regulatory costs and other things that might stack up, but I would like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like showing stability to that point is probably the most important, and I don't know, that can probably look different company to company. Like, I don't know your specific like thesis or what like use case. I would honestly like iterate on like, what do we want to look like in 5 years? Like, what do we like manifest in the world as an L1 and down the road? And like, what are all the, I don't know, like tangential things that are happening because of that? Like, what do you want to be when you grow up, essentially? But it's like, it may tell you that you want to focus on like a certain, partnerships or like business development angle or something. Like there may be something that kind of becomes clear to you going through that. Does that make sense?
But like, it's like I don't see why. I mean, I don't think raising X amount of money would be kind of a goal that you want to achieve.
Yeah.
But I guess if that shows stability in the market, if it attracts partners and moves, it might be something that you'd have to keep in mind, right?
I see. Yeah. So one caveat I'll give. So I wouldn't necessarily raise for the sake of raising, but I also don't want, like, I'm not making investment decisions here, so I don't want to like color anything, right? Like I'm on the operating side, so I don't know what you've been told, and I don't want to like negate anything like that. But I think as a general rule, and as someone that's been has fundraised many times as a CFO, like I always want to fundraise with a purpose and with a reason to invest that money. Like there's a very clear purpose of like, I'm raising this money to invest towards this growth or this initiative because we want to look like XYZ when we grow up, right? And this is what we're trying to achieve. And usually it's like, you know, for example, we want to raise this next round because we're really great in the US and we want to expand internationally. We want to raise this round because we have launched the first version of our product and it's really working and we think there's an opportunity for like a next version of it, whatever the case may be. Like usually you do want a purpose, and I would like push on that and understanding really like what's behind that advice just to make sure you really understand it, because I do understand from like a community stability perspective, but also like, is there something else there that is the reason for that
Exactly
advice,
kind of the
right?
question that if you've seen some L1s and how they budgeted, but we can talk about it later.
Yeah, we can have a follow-up session on it because I can certainly like look at some of our companies in that space, but like I don't know anything that I can like publicly speak to on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I have two questions. The first is like when we plan for fundraising, how do you plan for the cycles? Because you know different cycle have different market
Yeah.
sentiment. The second question is like when we plan for operation, how should we plan for the action items that has like that has all these uncertainties for like for example like R&D, like that might work, might not work, or like we like identify we miss this key person, want to hire this person, but we might not end up finding this person or not. So you know, like from a strategic point of view, we always learn something from the setbacks. But from operational point of view, I wonder is there any like a rigor we can put into this kind of uncertain outcome at item?
Yeah, I mean, on your first point, from a fundraising perspective, I think, unfortunately, like you can't plan, right? You can't plan the market. The only thing you can do there is take advantage when it's good and hunker down when it's bad and try to just execute. So as far as that's concerned, I don't think like just make sure that you're aware of the cycles and like aware of the market dynamics so that you're not kind of caught flat-footed there. In terms of like the best practices for your other question, I think part of it is identifying what, like R&D, for an example, like if you're investing in something and then there's like an end result that, you know, you're building something, whatever, there's an end result, whether it's like a launch or whatever. Identifying the success metrics before that launch is really important. Like before things get emotional is kind of how I like to think about it. It's like, okay, this is going to launch. What do we expect? If you're telling me after you, yes, we launched this thing, and I'm like, so was it a good launch? How do you know? You can't decide if it's good or not after you launched it. Like, it's just not very effective. You should decide before, hey, 30 days in, if we see this, that would be positive. If we see this, we've got some real concerns. And you're going to be wrong, like to my point on budget, you're going to be wrong, but you need to kind of put something in place before it's like emotional, because then you have something to kind of like, okay, do we need to have a conversation? Is this good or bad? You have a pulse on it quickly, you know? And so that's probably the best advice I have there, is just like identifying what is going to be good, what's going to surprise you, what's not. And to the point on outcomes versus activity on like the first question, there's a few layers of that, right? Because an outcome is launching something, and you may want to incentivize people to launch something or like finish something. And that's great. Like that's actually a good thing. It's like a binary outcome, right? But then the outcome after that, it's actual performance. And so you have to think about that in your metrics and what you're monitoring, because it's sort of like if you go public, the IPO is the event, it's the launch, but like that does not make a good company. You have to like monitor the process after. I don't know if that helped, but like that's what I would be encouraging if I were like at your company. Okay, like how are we going to put metrics in place before launch?
Got it, thank you. For hiring, it's similar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, in early stage startups, there's a lot of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times people maybe don't like planning.
I know. Yeah.
There's some pushback
Yep.
because they feel like it's just an academic
Yep.
thing. Even if you do the very basic stuff
Yeah.
that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Are there some more thoughts on that? How to
Yeah, I definitely know that. And it's also why I did try to make the point, like, don't be too academic, like, keep it really simple. I believe that the act of talking about it and putting it on paper and making like active trade-offs in what you're working on is the important part. But you have to do it because especially as you add people to the team, you cannot really risk that people are working on things that are not driving the goal that you are trying to achieve. And if there's just not clear like transparency around that or communication around that, even with the best intentions, people might misinterpret what you want them to work on, or they might not understand the purpose of why what they're doing is important, or, you know, like it really does not have to be a big exercise, but I do think the act of discussing it, putting it on paper, and giving yourself some parameters is important. And you don't have to like make a big thing out of it.
Yeah, I think that's something that has made it maybe worse sometimes is seeing after the fact how wildly off we were,
Yeah.
how things changed.
Yeah.
And then people are feeling to not want to do that again.
Yeah, I've been there. I totally understand that. So one of the things is if you're doing something for the first time, it's not like you're, I don't know, like Microsoft forecasting revenue. You have no idea what is going to happen in your business. So anything you guess, especially with like a new product or a timeline of launch, it's going to be wrong. It's going to be wrong. It's just you're swimming in the same direction. There is not punitive either. It's just, again, especially when it comes to cash burn, if you're not like watching it, because let's just say you don't make a plan. You're just like, okay, hey team, we're working towards this thing. We're gonna launch this product. We think it's gonna launch next summer. And we're all like working towards it. You're all going towards it. Now, if you raise so much capital that like you have, you know, sometimes these companies have like 5+ years of runway, you can do that. Like, honestly, like it's not going to be, you might burn more than you need. You might not burn more than you need. You can do that. But it doesn't create a good like discipline around focus on what you're working on. And it doesn't build that muscle. So let's say you're just like a normal company that maybe has like 2 years of runway or something. And you say that, but you have no plan. And everyone's working on it. And then you get to next summer and you decide, oh, let's just kind of check on where we are. You hired like 5 more people than you planned because there wasn't a plan. So it's not that you hired 5 more people than you planned. You just hired more people than maybe you kind of thought loosely. And then you also are running, you know, 3 to 6 months behind on your product. All of a sudden you wake up and it's like the end of next year and you're like, oh my gosh, I just looked at we have 6 months of runway. I didn't even know. Like, I thought we were only burning $200K a month. We've been burning $600K a month. I didn't even know. And so to me, it's more about the visibility. And it's like, how do I know what's going on in my business? And how do I have a pulse on how things are tracking, how people are doing, what our cash burn is? And you've got to be on top of that. Shouldn't be surprised. So like there's going to be varying degrees of like there's companies that have excelled and done phenomenally well without putting a lot of thought into planning. There are companies that have planned incredibly well and still fail, right? And so that's to my first slide on like, if you can control it though, like you can control the planning process and the thought process there. That's like one of the few things you can control. So you do it in the way that works for your company culturally and for you personally as a founder. Like, don't try to fit in anyone else's box there.
Could you give us your opinions about the best way to ground salary and compensation negotiations? Like, I know the right way is you start by budgeting for the hire. How do you do that? Where do you get the like eyeballed rates for that? And then the other thing, which is kind of unrelated, is if you're working with external accountants, external tax accountants, or fractional CFOs, could you give some tips for finding the right people, vetting them, and running that relationship? Like, how should the work be split? And like, generally, what should our expectations be going into those relationships?
On the hiring front, we have a great people practices partner, Medan, and we also have our talent team. They have a lot of benchmarking on that. So I think starting with benchmarking, and so I'll give like a very quick answer, but if you want to dive deep, like they're great for that. I think it's understanding your compensation philosophy as a business, generally speaking, is helpful, right? Like, are we a company that is going to pay 50% or 100% of market rates, right? Anything in between, like kind of getting a sense of what your philosophy is, and then coming up with the benchmarks that we can provide. Tools like Pave have them, and in terms of budgeting, you would just kind of take that range from the benchmarking data. When to deviate from it's kind of like a cultural question. Some companies might be really firm on like not deviating from it because they feel like we're gonna be kind of consistent and fair. Other people are like, this person's fantastic, I'm gonna do that. But I would say being intentional on how you're handling comp, especially from an early stage, so you don't kind of once you make someone's comp, you're not going to change it later. So generally speaking, so kind of just being intentional of like how you want to do that from the beginning is important. But yeah, Medan would be great, and our people team they have a lot of data there that they can provide from a benchmarking perspective, and even just like toolkits on like building a compensation philosophy. So most of you will use external accountants for sure. Like I mean, I don't know the size of all your companies, but like it's a while before you need someone full time in house, depending on the business. So there are a few, like there's some that we recommend that I'm happy to provide contact info for that are sort of vetted that also know crypto really well. We've seen in the past, like years ago, or sometimes, companies work with one that's not really like crypto knowledgeable, and that can be a problem. Like even if it's fine now, like it might not be later. So there's a handful of outsourced accounting and finance folks that do a really good job in our space. In terms of how hands-on they should be, what they should do, the sort of like fractional outsource model is great because you can dial it up and dial it down as you need them. So there's usually a baseline set of work that they'll do that's just like bookkeeping, right? They're like closing the books, they'll set up, if you don't have things like Ramp or other credit card platforms, or you need like your Mercury plugged into your QuickBooks or whatever, like they'll help you set all that stuff up. And they'll do just all the bookkeeping on a monthly basis. And then they'll give you a report at the end of the month. And that's where you should kind of make sure you're reviewing it and that you're available to answer questions along the month if they have them. But like if they're just kind of paying transactions, recording transactions, and they're giving you a summary at the end of the month, like that's where you'd want to make sure you're looking at so you're not surprised at anything. And then if there is something you want to kind of dial them up for, most of them have actually like more finance analyst type people. Like if you were going through a fundraise and you wanted their help building a model, or if they usually have like HR back office too. Like if you want someone to kind of do more of like HR operations kind of stuff, like benefits, things like that, like they usually have people like that can help depending on the firm. So there's some of that like G&A kind of back office stuff that you can outsource. And I would just have some sort of recurring check-ins with them and make sure that you're touching base on like I mentioned earlier, like, transactions over a certain dollar, or things that are out of the ordinary that they haven't seen. There's things that you're going to spend on every month, but if something is kind of out of the ordinary of that, can they raise it to you? Like, so finding out your threshold for plugging in with them, but like all the sort of routine stuff, you can totally outsource to them. And most of them will build you a financial model. They'll help you think about all of that, and you can dial them up if you need them more.
You had mentioned there are a lot of hidden costs involved in hiring. Is there a rule of thumb for estimating those hidden costs as potentially a percentage of
good point.
salary? Is there like a expected range for that where, if you're spending this much extra per employee, that's too much versus too little? And does that scale like linearly over time with salaries? Or as you grow, is that kind of overhead cost going to increase or decrease?
So in terms of rule of thumb, it kind of depends what you include in it and what you do as a company. Like from the perspective of if you have office space, you want to maybe include like office space in that. But If you travel a lot and you do like offsites or you're like traveling around, it's like, are there travel costs or are all you guys just kind of like huddled one place? And there's, so I don't have like a good rule of thumb necessarily, but I would look at your current, to simplify your budget, I would look at how it plays out in your current team and just sort of scale that out. In terms of if it scales linearly or not, like, again, it kind of depends. It depends what you're including. If you're including something like office space, cost per head's going to go down. It just kind of depends how you're thinking about it. My main point with that is like, if you look at an income statement of most companies, like truly employees are the vast majority of it. And I've just seen situations where I get a budget to look at and it's like salaries are budgeted and then there's just like other stuff isn't factored in, or they have benefits as they are today, but it's not like linked to hiring growth, or it's just kind of simple things of like, you've got to fully burden the person.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I wonder when would be a sign for a founder to find, oh, I'm well overwhelmed and I need a executive assistant or chief of staff, and what's the difference between the two in terms of what kind of person do you look for?
Chief of staff is generally a bit more strategic and oftentimes can sit in your place for things. It really depends, like company to company. Chief of staff is one of those interesting roles, I would say, that if you look up definitions for it, it can mean very different things at different places. So I would say, like, what do you need? Do you need help, like, booking meetings and making sure you are, like, getting all the information coming to you, and maybe someone like managing your inbox or making sure you don't miss meetings and stuff? Like, do you need that? Do you need someone that sort of has your mental model and you trust to be in meetings for you potentially? Like, it's sort of like, what do you need? And I would say, what are the signs? Like, are you spending more time on things that you feel like you add less value to and are less critical to the business? That's kind of a good trigger of like, how do you spend your day? I only spent an hour of it on the thing that I think is most important in this business because I was doing all of these other things. It's like, okay, I probably need to hire someone, whether it's assistant, chief of staff, HR person, finance person, whatever it is. It's just like, how did I spend my time? Is this sort of breaking based on what I think is most important? And there's a tipping point. Thank you, guys.